I'm Chris Hansen. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're not. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The dingy coffee shop smelled of burnt toast and overbrewed coffee. A thin layer of grime coated the table where Martin sat, nervously tapping his fingers. Across from him sat a man with sharp features, an expensive suit, and a confident air. The man leaned forward, his piercing gaze fixed on Martin. I'm Chris Hansen, he said, his voice smooth but firm. Martin froze, his heart skipping a beat. No, you're not, he said, trying to muster some authority. The man chuckled softly, tilting his head like a predator sizing up prey. Yes, I am, the man insisted, his eyes narrowing slightly. Martin's throat tightened. The air felt heavy, the room growing impossibly still. No, you're not. Martin shot back, louder this time, his voice cracking. The man's smile faded, replaced by an icy stare. Martin glanced around, searching for an ally, a way out. The few patrons in the cafe seemed oblivious, immersed in their own lives. The man reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately. Martin's palms began to sweat, his pulse hammering in his ears. He leaned back, ready to bolt, as the man produced a sleek wallet. Flipping it open, he revealed an ID card. There it was, clear as day, Chris Hansen. Martin's stomach dropped. You've been chatting with someone you shouldn't have, the man said, his voice low and deliberate. A knot formed in Martin's gut as he remembered the messages, the secrets he thought were buried. The man leaned closer, his breath cold against Martin's cheek. Why don't you have a seat? Martin's chair scraped the floor as he stumbled backward, his vision tunneling. Before he could flee, the cafe door swung open. Two officers walked in, their eyes locking onto Martin. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a joke. And the man in front of him was exactly who he said he was. Martin's knees buckled, and he sank back into the chair. The officers approached with measured steps, their expressions grim. Chris Hansen, if that really was him, stayed perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Martin's face. You know why we're here, one officer said, his tone cutting through the fog in Martin's mind. I don't, Martin stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The other officer pulled out a folder and dropped it on the table with a thud. Photographs spilled out, each one more damning than the last. Conversations, screen captures, receipts. Martin's breath hitched as his own words stared back at him, black and white proof of his guilt. This isn't real, he muttered, shaking his head. Oh, it's very real, Chris said, his voice calm but unyielding. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room. Martin felt as though the walls were closing in, the air thinning by the second. His mouth opened to protest, but no words came out. Chris leaned forward again, his presence overwhelming. You thought you were anonymous, didn't you? Untouchable. Martin's eyes darted toward the door, calculating his chances. The officers noticed and stepped closer, their hands hovering near their belts. There's nowhere to run, one of them said firmly. Martin's chest heaved, his mind racing for an escape, a loophole, anything. Chris tapped the folder with one finger. This is just the beginning, he said, his voice steady as a metronome. Martin's world crumbled as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. The chatter of the coffee shop faded to nothing but white noise. Time seemed to slow as the officers pulled out the cuffs. The cold metal snapped around his wrists, jarring him back to reality. Chris stood, adjusting his tie with a satisfied air. As Martin was hauled to his feet, Chris leaned in one final time. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Remember, Martin? You did this to yourself? The words echoed in Martin's head as the officers led him out into the blinding sunlight. People turned to watch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. And as the cafe door swung shut behind him, Martin realized one undeniable truth. He had been caught, and there was no escaping the consequences. The sunlight felt like needles piercing Martin's skin as the officers escorted him to the waiting patrol car. Every step was a parade of shame. Each face in the crowd another reminder that his secrets were no longer his own. The distant hum of the city seemed louder now, the world moving on without him as his life unraveled. The car door opened, and the officers guided him inside with practiced precision. The cold leather seat stuck to his skin, a fitting contrast to the heat of his shame. As the door slammed shut, Martin caught one last glimpse of Chris Hansen, standing on the cafe steps. His figure was calm, almost statuesque, as he watched the car pull away. Martin's mind raced, fragments of excuses and justifications swirling in a storm of denial and regret. But deep down, beneath the panic, a truth gnawed at him. He had known this day would come. The officers sat in silence, their expressions unreadable, as the city blurred past the windows. "Where are we going?" Martin croaked, his voice breaking like dry wood. The officer in the passenger seat turned, his eyes sharp but emotionless. "Booking," he replied curtly. Martin's stomach churned. His hands fidgeted against the cuffs, the metal biting into his wrists with every movement. He tried to focus on the world outside, on anything but the growing pit in his stomach. But the weight of the folder, the photos, the messages, it was unbearable. The patrol car slowed, pulling into a gray, foreboding building surrounded by chain-link fences and barbed wire. Martin felt the walls of his life close in tighter with every second. The officers led him inside, through a series of sterile hallways that smelled faintly of bleach and despair. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glow exposing every flaw, every detail he wanted to hide. A clerk behind a desk glanced up as they approached, her face impassive as she began processing his intake. Name, date of birth, address. Each question chipped away at the last shreds of Martin's composure. Finally, they led him to a holding cell, the bars cold and unyielding as the door clanged shut behind him. The sound echoed in his ears, final and unforgiving. Martin sank onto the hard bench, his head in his hands. This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the end of the life he had known. And as he sat there, alone with his thoughts, one image lingered in his mind. Chris Hansen, calm and unrelenting, reminding him of the inescapable truth. "You did this to yourself." Hours felt like days as Martin sat in the holding cell. The murmur of other detainees echoed faintly down the hallway, but none of it registered. His mind was a whirlwind of panic and despair, replaying the events over and over like a nightmare on a loop. He tried to rationalize, to convince himself this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. But the weight of the evidence, the photos, the messages, that piercing look in Chris Hansen's eyes, shattered every attempt. The metallic creak of the cell door opening jolted him from his thoughts. A guard stepped in, clipboard in hand, his expression as cold and detached as the walls around them. "Martin Dawson," the guard called, his voice echoing in the sterile space. Martin nodded weakly, his body sluggish as if he were moving underwater. "Your lawyer's here," the guard added, motioning for him to stand. Martin's heart thudded in his chest as he rose, the cuffs clicking back around his wrists. They led him down another series of fluorescent-lit hallways, the monotony of the environment amplifying his dread. Finally, they stopped in front of a small room with a single table and 2 chairs. Through the narrow window, Martin caught sight of a man in a sharp suit, his briefcase resting neatly on the table. The guard opened the door, and Martin shuffled in, his legs unsteady. The man looked up, his expression a mixture of professionalism and thinly veiled disappointment. "Mr. Dawson," the lawyer said, gesturing to the seat across from him. Martin sank into the chair, avoiding eye contact. "Do you understand the charges against you?" the lawyer asked, his voice calm but firm. Martin shook his head slightly, his throat dry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he mumbled, his words tumbling out clumsily. The lawyer's eyes narrowed. "Intent doesn't matter here, Martin. What matters is what they have on you." He opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of papers. "This isn't a fight we can win outright," the lawyer continued. "But if we cooperate, if you tell me everything, I might be able to negotiate something less severe." Martin's stomach lurched. "Less severe," he repeated, his voice cracking. The lawyer leaned forward, his tone dropping to a whisper. "Martin, you're facing serious prison time. And given the nature of your case," he trailed off, his meaning painfully clear. Martin's vision blurred as the reality sank in. Prison. A place where men like him didn't just serve time, they survived it. He swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The lawyer sighed, his pen tapping against the table. "Start by telling me the truth," he said. But Martin hesitated, the weight of his lies too heavy to untangle. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as silence stretched between them. And for the first time, Martin realized there might be no way out. No redemption. No escape. Only the long, dark shadow of the choices he had made. The silence was unbearable, stretching like a taut wire ready to snap. Martin's eyes darted to the papers on the table, the evidence laid bare for anyone to see. His throat felt constricted, words trapped behind a barrier of shame and fear. The lawyer leaned back, studying Martin's face with a practiced calm. "Listen," he said, his tone softening slightly. "If you want me to help you, I need everything, the whole story. No holding back." Martin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to compose himself. His fingers fidgeted nervously against the cuffs, the metal biting into his skin. Finally, he exhaled shakily and nodded. "I didn't think it was serious at first," he began, his voice trembling. "It was just stupid messages. A joke, really." The lawyer's expression didn't change, but his pen scratched notes onto the legal pad in front of him. Martin continued, words spilling out in a rush. "I mean, yeah, I knew it was wrong, but it didn't feel real. You know?" He looked up, searching the lawyer's face for even a flicker of understanding. But the lawyer's gaze remained impassive, his pen pausing mid-sentence. "You knew it was wrong, and yet you kept going," the lawyer said, his tone cold and clinical. Martin flinched at the bluntness of the statement. I didn't think anyone would find out," he stammered, his voice rising in desperation. "I thought it was private, just between me and—" He stopped himself, his face draining of color as he realized what he was about to admit. The lawyer's eyes narrowed. "Between you and who, Martin?" Martin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing in on him with crushing force. The lawyer leaned forward, his voice now a sharp whisper. "Martin, if you withhold anything from me, I can't protect you. Do you understand that?" Martin nodded weakly, his hands trembling in his lap. "It was someone online," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know their real name. They said they were older. I swear they did." The lawyer's pen stopped moving. "They said they were older," he repeated, his tone heavy with skepticism. Martin nodded frantically, desperate to cling to any shred of justification. "I didn't think it was what they're saying it is," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the table. The lawyer sat back, exhaling slowly. "Martin," he said after a long pause, "this isn't going to be easy. The evidence they have, it paints a very different picture." Martin felt the floor drop out from beneath him. What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The lawyer's eyes bore into him, unflinching. "I'm saying you need to prepare yourself for the worst." The words hit Martin like a sledgehammer, the finality of them echoing in his mind. His vision blurred, tears welling up as the gravity of his situation became undeniable. The lawyer gathered his papers, standing with an air of quiet finality. "I'll do what I can," he said, his tone flat. "But Martin, there are some things even I can't fix." With that, the door clicked shut, leaving Martin alone once again. The walls of the holding cell seemed to close in tighter than before, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the room. And for the first time, Martin truly understood what Chris Hansen had meant. He had done this to himself. And now, there was no way to outrun the reckoning that awaited him. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Martin sat in the sterile holding cell, the silence deafening. The weight of the lawyer's words lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. He could still hear the echo of the door clicking shut, the finality of it settling deep within him. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, a constant reminder of the cold, mechanical nature of his new reality. The door opened again, But this time it wasn't the lawyer returning. A different officer stepped in, his face unreadable. "Time to go," the officer said, his voice clipped. Martin's heart skipped a beat as he stood, the cuffs scraping against his wrists. Where were they taking him now? His mind raced, searching for any scrap of hope, any reason to believe things could still turn around. But deep down, he knew it was too late. The officer didn't say another word as he led Martin down the narrow hallway. The buzz of the lights, the muted sounds of distant voices, it all blurred together, creating an oppressive sense of isolation. As they reached the end of the corridor, the officer motioned for Martin to stop. Another guard, a woman this time, was waiting near a set of double doors. They led him through the heavy doors and into a brightly lit, almost sterile room. At the far end of the room, a large one-way mirror ran the length of the wall. Martin instinctively glanced at it, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. "Have a seat," the officer said, his hand on Martin's shoulder, guiding him to a chair. He sat down, his legs trembling beneath him. The woman officer remained standing by the door, her eyes fixed on him, unblinking. Time seemed to stretch as Martin sat in the chair, his body tense and his thoughts a jumble of confusion and dread. Suddenly, the door behind the mirror clicked open, and a figure stepped into the room. Chris Hansen. Martin's breath caught in his throat. He had thought he was done with him, that the man would disappear into the haze of his worst memories. But here he was, as calm and composed as ever, walking towards Martin with deliberate steps. "I hope you're comfortable, Martin," Chris said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. Martin opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He could only stare, his heart hammering in his chest. "Don't worry," Chris continued, his tone almost comforting. "We're just getting started." The words slithered into Martin's mind, and the walls seemed to close in even tighter. There was no escaping this, no bargaining his way out. The moment he had feared, the one he had tried so desperately to avoid, had arrived. And now, there was no turning back. Chris Hansen stood before him, his gaze unwavering, as if he could see through every layer of Martin's guilt and fear. The silence in the room felt oppressive, a heavy weight that pressed against Martin's chest. Chris took a slow step forward, his voice calm, but filled with an undeniable authority. "Do you know why you're here, Martin?" he asked, his eyes never leaving Martin's face. Martin swallowed hard, his mouth dry as dust. I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. Chris leaned in slightly, his tone sharp, cutting through the lie with precision. "You and I both know that's not true," he said, his voice low and steady. Martin flinched as the words hit him like a slap, the reality of his situation crashing down harder than ever. "Let's get something straight," Chris continued, his eyes narrowing. "The evidence is clear. You crossed the line, and there's no one here to save you but yourself." Martin's hands clenched into fists, his mind swirling in a whirlwind of regret and panic. He thought he could escape, that he could hide behind the anonymity of the internet. But the truth was undeniable now. There was no hiding, no more excuses. Chris stepped back, glancing over his shoulder at the officer standing by the door. The officer nodded, and a sense of finality filled the room. Martin could feel his heart race, the beat pounding in his ears, the overwhelming pressure of the moment suffocating him. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Chris asked, his voice softer now, but no less dangerous. Martin's throat felt tight, his words trapped as he tried to form a coherent sentence. But the truth was, there was nothing left to say. The consequences of his actions had already caught up with him. The door to the room opened again, and a second officer stepped in, his expression grim. "It's time," the officer said, his eyes briefly meeting Martin's before turning back to Chris. Chris nodded, stepping aside. As Martin was guided out of the room, his legs unsteady, his body numb, he couldn't help but glance back one last time at Chris. There was no sympathy in the man's eyes. No mercy. Just a cold, unrelenting certainty that Martin had crossed a line he couldn't return from. The officers led him down another hallway, the distant sound of doors slamming shut, the echo of his life slipping through his fingers. Every step felt like it was sinking him deeper into the pit of his own choices. And as they reached the final set of doors, the world outside began to fade, replaced by the cold, suffocating reality of the life he had made for himself. There was no turning back now. Martin was about to step into a new reality, a place where there were no excuses left, no place to hide from the consequences of his actions. The door swung open, and the bright lights of the outside world blinded him for a moment. But when his eyes adjusted, he saw it clearly, the beginning of the rest of his life, a life that would never be the same again. As the officers led Martin out into the harsh daylight, the weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders. He squinted against the bright light, the world outside blurring before his eyes. Every sound, every movement felt distant, like he was watching it all from behind a glass wall. The cold, metal cuffs chafed against his wrists, a constant reminder of the irreversible path he had taken. People moved around him, their lives going on as usual, but to Martin, everything felt unreal. He was no longer part of the world he once knew. The officers guided him towards a waiting vehicle, the sound of their boots echoing on the pavement. A long black SUV, its tinted windows hiding the inside from prying eyes. Martin was shoved into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a finality that shook him to his core. The vehicle began to move, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the space. No one spoke. The silence felt suffocating. Martin's hands trembled as he sat back against the seat, his mind racing in a desperate attempt to make sense of everything. How had it all come to this? He thought of the moments before, when Chris Hansen had walked into that room, when he had seen the evidence, the photos, the undeniable proof. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had convinced himself that he could hide, that he could talk his way out of any situation. But now, there was no escaping the truth. There was no more time to deny it. The SUV made a sharp turn, taking him further away from everything he knew. Martin's chest tightened as the world outside seemed to close in around him. Where were they taking him? What was next? He wasn't sure he wanted to know. The silence continued, broken only by the sound of the tires against the pavement, and Martin's own ragged breaths. The vehicle slowed, pulling up to a grim, nondescript building that looked like any other in the city. But to Martin, it might as well have been a prison. The doors opened, and the officers let him inside. The cold, sterile air of the building greeted him, and the distant sound of buzzing lights only deepened his sense of dread. He was no longer in control of his own life. And as they walked him down a long corridor, the reality of his fate settled in fully. There would be no quick fix, no magic words to undo the mess he had made. He had crossed a line, one that couldn't be erased. This was the beginning of his new life, a life shaped by the consequences of his choices. And as the heavy door to the holding cell clanged shut behind him, Martin knew that the future he had once imagined was gone. He was alone now, in a world he had no part in creating. All he could do was wait for what was coming next. The clang of the door echoed in the small, sterile room as Martin was left alone, the world outside completely shut off. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stood there, staring at the cold walls. The silence was deafening. There were no comforting sounds of life beyond these walls. No distractions. Just the harsh reality of his situation pressing in from all sides. He paced back and forth in the small cell, his movements stiff, robotic. His mind was a whirlwind, racing through the past days, weeks, months. Every mistake, every wrong decision, now catching up with him in a way that felt too overwhelming to process. It was impossible to escape the thoughts that gnawed at him. He remembered the conversations, the texts, the brief flashes of hope he had held on to in his delusion. He remembered how easy it had been to hide behind a screen, to make excuses, to pretend that there would be no consequences. Now, every action had consequences. Every choice had led him to this point. He stopped in front of the small window, his breath fogging up the glass as he peered outside. The world beyond was indifferent, moving on without him. He felt a bitter sting of isolation, the realization that he was truly alone, stripped of everything that once felt secure. Minutes stretched into hours, and Martin found himself sitting on the cold metal bench, his eyes heavy, his mind exhausted from the ceaseless swirl of thoughts. The door to the cell creaked open again, and Martin's heart lurched in his chest. For a moment, he hoped it would be someone with answers, someone who could offer a way out. But instead, a guard stepped in, his face impassive. "Time for your hearing," the guard said flatly. Martin nodded numbly, too tired to protest, too beaten down by the weight of his own choices to do anything but comply. They led him through the corridors again, the sound of his footsteps hollow and lonely in the cold, concrete hallways. The heavy door to the courtroom-like room opened, and Martin was escorted to a small chair in the middle of the room. It felt like a farce, like some surreal version of justice. The judge took their seat, the courtroom bustling with officers and other staff members as Martin sat, barely able to keep his head up. Chris Hansen's presence lingered at the edge of his mind, his words echoing. Asterisk, we're just getting started. Asterisk. Martin's stomach twisted, and he wondered fleetingly if this was what he deserved. A familiar voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. "Martin Dawson," the judge called, his voice cold and commanding. Martin blinked, focusing for the first time. His name, but it no longer felt like his own. The judge continued, outlining the charges, the evidence, the severity of his crimes. Every word felt like a blow. Every syllable another chain wrapping around him. He could barely focus on the details, his mind still reeling from the shock of it all. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Martin couldn't catch the words. The world seemed to spin around him as the judge's voice became a blur. And in that moment, all he could think about was the fact that there was no escape, no going back. Everything had come crashing down. And now, as the judgment was about to be passed, Martin realized the truth. His future, as he had known it, was over. The judge's voice cut through the haze, loud and clear, as he pronounced the verdict. Martin barely heard the words. They blurred together, a jumbled mess of legal terms that no longer mattered. Guilty. The word echoed in his mind, repeating over and over. It was a cold, final declaration, a sentence that marked the end of everything he once held dear. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in as the weight of his fate settled over him. The faces in the courtroom, those who had gathered to witness his downfall, were distant and indifferent. All of them, lawyers, officers, even the judge, seemed like mere shadows. In that moment, it was as if the world had disappeared entirely, leaving Martin alone with the crushing reality of his actions. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp, authoritative crack. "Sentencing will proceed," the judge said, and Martin's heart sank. He couldn't even focus on the specifics of what was being said anymore. His mind was spinning, trapped in a vortex of guilt and regret. The years of his life, the decisions he made, had led him here to this stark, sterile room. And now, there was no escape. He wasn't sure how long it took before the sentencing was over. But when the court session was dismissed, Martin was escorted out of the room, his legs weak beneath him, his heart heavy with despair. As they led him back through the same cold corridors, the harsh lights seemed to burn brighter, the oppressive silence louder. His lawyer, who had been quiet throughout the entire proceeding, now offered a few words of reassurance. "It's not over yet," the lawyer said, his voice low, but Martin didn't hear him. The words barely registered. Nothing mattered anymore. They took him back to his holding cell, the familiar clang of the door locking behind him once again. But this time, the feeling was different. It wasn't just the door that was closing. It was the world. The door was locked, and so was his future. As Martin sat in the cold, barren cell, the echo of his choices played over and over in his mind. The mistakes, the lies, the twisted, misguided beliefs that had led him to this place. He had crossed a line he could never uncross, and now he would have to live with it for the rest of his life. The hours stretched on in the cell, the silence pressing against Martin like an invisible weight. The dull hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound, their buzz sharp and relentless in the stillness. Martin sat against the cold concrete wall, his knees drawn to his chest. He had no strength left to fight, no energy to resist the crushing realization that this was his life now. The future he had once dreamed of, the one filled with possibilities, had disintegrated into nothing. The weight of the judgment, the word guilty, was unbearable, suffocating him in the small space of his mind. He had hoped, even for a moment, that maybe he could escape this fate. But deep down, he knew that there was no escaping the truth anymore. No more hiding. No more excuses. The door to his cell suddenly creaked open, the sound startling Martin out of his stupor. A guard stepped in, his expression unreadable. "It's time," the guard said, his voice flat. Martin didn't move at first, his body still frozen in the numbness of his despair. For a moment, he wondered if he was even capable of moving anymore. But then, slowly, he forced himself to his feet. His legs felt shaky, unsteady, as though he had forgotten how to walk. They led him down another long, sterile corridor, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead in an almost mocking manner. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though his very body was protesting the reality he had to face. Eventually, they arrived at a small room with a desk and a few chairs. Across from the desk, Chris Hansen was waiting for him, his expression as stoic as ever. Martin's breath hitched in his throat as he saw the man again. It felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Chris's eyes locked onto his, piercing and unrelenting. "Have a seat, Martin," Chris said, his voice calm but firm. Martin hesitated before sitting down, his body trembling slightly. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words were lost. Chris studied him for a long moment, his gaze never wavering. "You know why I'm here," Chris said after a long pause, his tone carrying a weight that felt impossible to bear. Martin nodded, but he couldn't find his voice. He knew what was coming. The inevitable conclusion. "You'll be facing the consequences for your actions," Chris continued, his voice matter of fact. "There's no going back now." The finality of those words sank into Martin's bones, and for the first time, he fully grasped the enormity of what he had done. He had made choices, horrible, unforgivable choices, and now there was no escape. Chris stood up, his eyes still fixed on Martin. "There's a long road ahead of you, Martin," he said, his words almost a whisper. And with that, Chris turned and walked out of the room, leaving Martin to face the cold, harsh reality alone once more. The door slammed shut behind him, and Martin sank back in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. He had no idea what the future held, only that it was going to be a life filled with consequences, and no amount of pleading would ever change that. All he had now were the memories of his mistakes, and the weight of the life he had destroyed. The silence that followed was deafening, and Martin sat there, unable to move, unable to think clearly. He stared at the desk in front of him, the wood worn from years of use, the edges chipped and scarred. It felt symbolic somehow, like everything around him had been damaged, just like his life. He tried to push his thoughts away, to escape the crushing weight of his guilt, but it was impossible. Everything he had done, everything that had led him to this point, flashed through his mind like an endless loop. The choices, the lies, the moments of weakness he thought he could outrun. But no more. No more running. The door creaked open once again, and Martin looked up, his heart skipping a beat. A guard stepped inside, his face impassive as always. "Time to go," the guard said. Martin nodded mechanically, standing slowly. The guard led him out of the room, the fluorescent lights once again casting harsh shadows across the sterile hallway. With every step, it felt as if the walls were closing in even tighter around him. He was being led to a new chapter in his life, one that was filled with nothing but uncertainty and regret. The outside world felt so far away now. The guard stopped in front of a large steel door and gestured for Martin to enter. Martin stepped inside, where a row of officers stood, waiting to escort him to wherever he was being sent next. He barely registered their faces as they guided him to the waiting van, its engine idling, the cold air outside biting at his skin. The door to the van slammed shut, and the vehicle jolted into motion, taking him further away from everything he had once known. As the city passed by, blurred and distant through the van's small, barred window, Martin's thoughts returned to Chris Hansen and his final words. Asterisk, there's a long road ahead of you. Asterisk, what would that road look like? Would he ever be able to make amends? Would he ever be able to escape the weight of the past? The van turned a corner, and Martin's gaze dropped to the floor. There was no easy answer, and maybe there never would be. But one thing was certain. His life was no longer his own. The decisions he had made had put him here, and now it was up to him to face whatever came next. He didn't know what that would be, but he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. The road ahead was long, and it was filled with consequences. And as the van continued its journey, Martin knew that it was only just beginning. The van finally slowed to a halt, the hum of the engine fading as the doors creaked open. Martin was led out into a gray courtyard surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire. The air was cold and still, carrying a weight that matched the somber environment. This was it, his new home, a place where time seemed to stand still. The guards marched him through the heavy iron gates, their footsteps echoing against the stone. Inside, the prison was stark and utilitarian, with dim lighting and an oppressive atmosphere. The walls bore the marks of countless lives that had passed through, each one a story of its own. Martin's chest tightened as he realized he was now part of this place, a number among many. The intake process was mechanical and impersonal. His fingerprints were taken, his personal belongings stripped away, replaced with the coarse fabric of a prison uniform. The weight of the uniform felt heavier than it should have, like a physical manifestation of his guilt. When they finally led him to his cell, the door clanged shut with a finality that made his heart sink. The small, barren space was devoid of comfort, just a cot, a toilet, and a small window too high to see out of. Martin sat on the edge of the cot, staring at the walls that now defined his world. For the first time, the enormity of his actions settled in fully. He had spent so long running, denying, and pretending that he could escape the truth. But now, there was nowhere left to hide. The weight of his guilt was immense, but beneath it was something else, a sliver of understanding. He couldn't undo what he had done, couldn't change the lives he had affected, but he could choose what came next. Perhaps he couldn't make amends in the way he wanted, but he could take responsibility. He could try to find some form of redemption, even if only within the confines of these walls. As the day turned into night, Martin lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to run. The road ahead was long and difficult, but it was his to walk. And perhaps in that journey, he could find a way to face the man he had become, and maybe, just maybe, become something better,